Here we go. So, welcome to our webinar, really looking at the implications from last week's elections. There will be more information to come in the weeks ahead, but we're really excited to have Tony Langenohl here today. Tony is a trusted and much appreciated partner at Michael Best Strategies, the contract lobbying firm that WIPCA has worked with for the last 8, 9 years. Really has an excellent perspective on what's going on in the state legislature in particular, and we're really pleased to have you here today, Tony. So our plan will be, I'm going to turn it over to Tony, who's going to run through a whole bunch of wonky data and slides for you, and then hopefully we'll save at least the last 10 minutes of our call here today for Q&A. We will conclude at 1 o'clock. I know the calendar invite was changed to 1:30. That was just an error, but we'll wrap up by 1. So Tony, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. I'll monitor the chat in case there's any burning questions as we go, but folks, feel free to add in questions and comments, and we can get to them too after Tony gets through his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richelle, and I apologize in advance to everyone for being off camera. I'm at home, kind of recuperating from pneumonia, so coming out of that right now. So appreciate your patience, and if I have to mute myself for a little coughing fit, apologize in advance for that. But like Richelle said, the real punchlines coming out of this presentation are the significant amounts of turnover in the legislature. I mean, we'll talk about the federal election results, both the president, Senate, and House. But the core of the conversation will really be about the legislature and the change over there and the consistent change over there and the opportunities to create new relationships and the importance of updating them on the services you provide to their constituents and your patients. So just start real quick at the top of the ticket with the presidential race. Heading into election day, most of the polls, and we used Real Clear polling average, had about 7 states that were complete toss-ups, representing about 93 electoral votes. So these were the gray states here, including Wisconsin, with our 10 electoral votes that were the focus of all the last minute campaigning, and were really going to be the states that decided which direction the presidential race would go. I don't think anybody had it on their bingo card that all 93 of those would go in one direction, but that's what happened on Tuesday, and President Trump got 312 electoral votes, sweeping all the competitive states. In Wisconsin, we had our highest presidential election turnout ever, 80,000 more votes than 2020. So a consistent gain over the last 3 presidential cycles. And the maps look pretty similar over the last 3 presidential cycles. President Trump in 2016 won by less than 1% of the vote. In 2020, President Biden won by less than 1% of the vote. And then again in 2024, President Trump won by less than 1% of the vote. So, roughly 20 to 30,000 votes have determined the last 3 presidential elections in a row. And I believe it's like 5 out of the last 7 or 6 in Wisconsin. So showing up and voting matters. And it doesn't, it shows itself in our presidential election results year after year. How Kamala Harris performed. So she increased the vote total over President Biden in 2020. She got about 37,000 more votes than he did in 2020, the second most of any Democratic presidential candidate, second only to President Obama in 2008. But that wasn't enough. President Trump was able to grow his vote share by 87,000 compared to 2020. So a significant uptick in performance to him. We like to, kind of look at the state. Not all counties produce the same number of votes. Obviously, we have higher dense population areas. There are 10 very dense population counties in Wisconsin that account for about 54% of a statewide elections vote. So those top 10 counties historically on the Democratic side is their biggest opportunity to run up the numbers. Vice President Harris came up a little bit short of what President Biden got in 2020 in those top 10 counties. In For President Trump, he was able to keep that gap pretty narrow. In the second other 62 counties, that's where he really drew his. I'm sorry, in this is mislabeled, so I apologize that. But it should say top 10 on both of those columns, so I apologize for that. But he was able to grow his vote total in the top 10 counties. So breaking down those top 10 counties and where they are, Milwaukee is the biggest vote producing county. Dane County is right behind Milwaukee County. Vice President Harris was able to grow her vote total over Biden by about 23,000 in those top 10 counties, but not by any great margin in any specific counties. And she actually lost votes compared to Biden in a couple of those counties, including Milwaukee County, which would have been an opportunity to grow some votes. President Trump was able to grow his vote totals and help diminish the impact of those top 10 counties in Vice President Harris's direction. When we move out to the remaining 62 counties, this is where President Trump was able to drive up his numbers. He got an additional 58,000 votes outstate, more than he got in 2020. Vice President Harris will only need to get 14,000 more than Biden outstate. So that's really where the delta was in this race, is, kept it close in the top 10 vote producing counties. No major gains by Harris there. And then he was able to squeeze more votes outstate than she was able to grow her vote totals outstate. So again, huge turnout in Wisconsin. Something that I think people weren't real, they knew there was voter intensity, but to have that big of an additional turnout was kind of surprising. Moving on to the U.S. Senate race, going into Election Day, there were 34 seats up in the U.S. Senate based on the seats that were up. Republicans were defending 11 seats. Democrats were defending 23. Republicans needed a net pickup of one seat to get the majority. That would have put them at 50, or to get the 50 with the Republican president. Needed one more seat in the competitive section to get to 51. They picked up 4 seats on Tuesday, which moved their majority up to 53. So they got the West Virginia seat that they were expecting, the Montana seat that was leaning their direction, and the toss-up Ohio seat, and then a lean Dem seat in the Pennsylvania seat. Here, Senator Tammy Baldwin successfully, won a third term by a narrow margin over Eric Hovde. She did this by overperforming Vice President Harris. She actually got 4,000 more votes than Vice President Harris. In that same comparison of outstate in the top 10 vote producing counties, Baldwin just trailed Harris in the top 10 vote producing counties, but outstate was able to make up that difference and then garner some more votes. I think one of the interesting things was Baldwin and Harris ran very close to each other, so only a 4,000 vote difference. There's a 54,000 vote difference between what Eric Hovde and Donald Trump got. Hovde trailed Donald Trump by 54,000 votes. So that's a kind of big number to have drop off from the top of the ticket. Part of the explanation for that was there were 3 independent candidates in the U.S. Senate race. There might have been some drag there. There's also about a 27,000 vote drop off between people that voted in the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race. Moving over to the U.S. House results, this gets a little bit more complicated. But the punchline here is there was about a huge chunk of seats here, 40 Democrat, 29 Republican, that were the big competitive, where all the money was spent in this election cycle. We had 2 of those races, the 3rd congressional with Derek Van Orden running for his first reelection and Congressman Brian Stile in the first. Of this mix here, Republicans needed to win 10 toss-up seats in the going into Election Day projections. Democrats needed to win 15 of the toss-up seats to take the majority. This is still not determined, but if Republicans got all their competitive seats and Democrats got all their competitive seats, Republicans theoretically would have came out of election day with a 221-214 majority. Here's the current status with 18 races yet to be called. There are 214 seats that have been called for the Republicans, 203 seats for the Democrats. You need 218 seats for the majority in that House. Not everybody protected their seats. Democrats were able to flip 4 Republican seats. Republicans were able to flip 6 Democrat seats. So that's kind of made the math a little murky still here, but you know, hoping to hear a couple more races called here shortly that'll give a little determination whether or not Democrats have an opportunity to grab the majority, or if Republicans will grab the 5 seats that need to get them over the 218 mark. Closer to home, it was a little less exciting. Republicans went into the election day with a 6-2 majority in our House delegation and came out with the same. And these numbers are relatively similar to what the 2022 results were for the state. Everybody performed pretty much on par, with Derek Van Orden once again being the most competitive of the races, but still, winning re-election, which, for Democrats looking to pick up a seat in the House, that was probably their best opportunity when you have a freshman running for re-election. The first term is the always easiest term to flip a seat. So moving over to control of the state legislature. This was the first cycle under the new maps, the second election cycle under new maps. But to what Richelle was talking about earlier, here's the turnover historically over the last several election cycles, but most notably, if you look at the 2022 and 2024, 68 new lawmakers have been elected in the last 2 cycles. Historically, the majority of people, the blue column, choose not to seek re-election. That's where the majority of the turnover normally comes from. And with 2 back-to-back redistricting new maps to run on, a lot of people made the decision not to run on maps that are significantly different than what they were previously elected to. So it's not unsurprising that there was this amount of turnover. You usually don't have 2 sets of new maps election after election. But the new thing was the number of incumbents defeated this cycle is 10, which is the second highest in recent political history. And here's kind of the breakdown. So we had the 27 that chose by June of this year not to seek re-election, which is a significant number. We had 4 lawmakers incumbent Republican lawmakers lose their primary. 3 of them, Schra, Schmidt, and Rozar, were paired with other incumbent Republicans because of the new maps. So we knew that, 1 Republican was going to not be reelected. And then Janelle Brandtjen was primaried by Senator Dan Knodel. So that was another incumbent Republican on another incumbent Republican primary. And then the 6 on top there were Republicans that were incumbents that were defeated by Democrats this election cycle. So no incumbent Democrats lost this cycle, and 10 Republicans either in the primary or in the general election lost. So a net pickup of 10 seats for the Democrats. So here are the 31 new faces in the state assembly. The red circles are the Republicans, the blue circles are the Democrats. Huge turnover on the Democrats. There are actually more Democrats than Republicans that chose not to seek re-election this cycle. But then you have the 10 that took Republican seats, or previously Republican held seats. And then here are the 6 new members of the state Senate, all Democrats that were elected this cycle. Drilling down more into the state assembly, showed you a version of this slide earlier before the election. This race really came down to, or the state assembly control was really going to come down to 12 seats. Both sides agreed to this, early on. These were the most, by the numbers, most competitive seats. We knew going into election day that Republicans would come back with a minimum of 46 seats and Democrats would come back with a minimum of 46 for the Republican, 41 for the Democrats. Democrats going into election day, saw all these blue bars going down, which means those seats are Democratic leaning, with Todd Novak in the 51st on the far right there being the most Democratic leaning seat held by an incumbent that was up the cycle. On the right, Rep. Clint Moses was running in the most competitive Republican seat that, was 3.5% in the Republicans' favor. Democrats seen all the blue bars said, hey, we have 9 of the 12 are, have a Democratic lean based on the historic performance at the top of the ticket. We should be in a good position to pick up at least 9. Republicans said, yes, but we have candidates that have a lot of experience in those districts. We have incumbents running in 8 of those seats. We feel we'll come back with a minimum of 8 of the 12 competitive seats. Republicans did come back with 8. They didn't carry one of their incumbents back and picked up an open seat. And Democrats won 4 of the competitive seats. So the majority at the start of this legislative session in the state assembly will be 54 Republicans, 45 Democrats. Just looking at how they did it, the green bar is the actual performance of the district. So so for Todd Novak, 4 equals. He did 4% better than his Democratic opponent. So he actually got 52% of the vote. His Democratic opponent got 48%. So that's where the +4 is in his column. His seat was rated a -8. So he way overperformed the historic performance of that district. And if you look down the list, all the Republicans in the seats the Republicans picked up overperform the historic performance of those districts. So this is something that Robin Voss always points to is, they may not have the most money. They, might not be able to put the same field force out there, but, they spend a lot of time recruiting the best candidates or, in this case, a lot of candidates that are incumbents that are, have been in the community quite a while. On the Democratic side, the 4 seats that they picked up, Steve Doyle always outperforms his district, always put in a very competitive district and always outperforms the Republican lean of the district he's in. The Democrats did pick up an open seat that was a lean Democratic. Amy Binsfield in the 26th, the Democrats picked up, because she was an incumbent Republican. I think she helped cut that number, what the Democratic advantage was there, but it is still too difficult for her to surpass that. So that was a Democratic pickup. And Jody Emerson, was pretty close to the historic performance of her district. So here is the composition of the state assembly. Again, 54-45. It's the lowest majority Republicans have had since retaking the majority in 2010. Not quite the 52-47 of the cycles before the houses flipped, but definitely a new environment that house is going to have to learn to operate in, and very narrow margins for passing things like the state budget. This is, to what Richelle brought up earlier too. Here is the turnover. For some reason I can't, part of the screen is blocking the composition there. So 22 of the 54 Republicans have been elected in the last 3 election cycles, and 35 of the 45 Democrats have been elected in the last 3 election cycles. So that is just huge turnover. So a lot of folks with not much historic knowledge of how the building operates, let alone issues of importance to WIPCA and your health centers. Moving to the state Senate, going into election day, only 16 of the 33 state Senate seats were on the ballot. We knew going into election day, just based on the seats that were up, Republicans were going to come back with a minimum of an 18-15 majority. They had 12 seats that were not up this cycle and will be up in 2026. They had 6 seats that were out of reach of the Democrats in their partisan Republican lean. So that gave them for sure a majority coming into this next session. Where the battle was regarding 5 competitive seats, those 4 seats in red in the middle and 1 Democratic hold in Brad Paff. Democrats had an advantage in those in 4 of the 5 seats, that they were leaning Democratic in their historic performance. And Dewey Strobel on the left was the only Republican seat that was up this cycle. Republicans thought Joan Ballweg in the 14th, because she was an incumbent, also would be able to, survive the wave of, a new district and a Democratic leaning district. But Democrats won all 5 of the competitive seats. So Republicans came back with the minimum of what they could, which is the 18 seats. And by winning the 5 competitive seats, that does put the Democrats in a position where they could pick up 2 seats next election cycle at a minimum that would get them into the majority after the 2026 elections, which was their major goal going into this cycle, knowing that they couldn't flip the state Senate. In contrast to how the Republicans performed in the state assembly races, Dems or in line with the way the assembly Republicans performed, Democrats performed the same way in the state Senate. All of their candidates overperformed the top of the historic performance of the district, with the exception of the Ballweg race, where that one came in just at the historic performance. But the rest of them, exceeded the historic performance of Democrats in those districts. So those were significant wins by them. So with a new 18-15 majority, this is the narrowest majority in that House in over a decade. And again, over more than half of the state Senate has been elected since 2020. So, huge turnover in that House, a lot of new faces. And again, a lot of turnover and no experience working with very slim majorities. So will be a very interesting session. As we mentioned, Democrats were automatically looking towards 2026 with this election cycle. These are the 4 races that are going to be on everyone's radar as it goes, as we start looking at elections 2 years from now. But, how things play out this legislative session. Senator Mark Lane was drawn into from a safe Republican district into a Democratic leaning district. Senator Rob Hutton in the 5th was drawn into a Democratic leaning district, and Senator Wongard was drawn from a really strong Republican district into a 50-50 district. The one Democratic seat that is in play that Democrats are going to have to protect is Jeff Smith in the Eau Claire area. 54% is kind of on the outer edge of a very competitive district, but it's the lowest ranking Democratic seat that'll be up next cycle that Republicans will be targeting. So if you're already missing the election commercials, have no fear. They will come back very shortly in probably about as much vigor as what you were seeing when our Wisconsin Supreme Court is up again this April. If conservatives, this is the last opportunity for conservatives to try and capture the court until, if they don't capture it this cycle, liberals will maintain control of the court till 2028 at the earliest, because the next couple cycles after this election cycle will be conservative position protects. So you'll see a lot of efforts by Republicans/conservatives to try and flip the court back. Obviously, the other side is going to spend a lot of money as well to kind of keep the court where it now is at. And this is going to suck up a lot of oxygen and will likely play over into the first quarter and into the 4th month of the legislative session, just because it is going to be a highly charged electoral environment with a lot of high stakes that folks will be very engaged in. So there are 2 announced candidates so far. This list could grow still, but definitely, if you're missing your election coverage and looking for something to focus on, have no fear. It's right around the corner. So transitioning from politics into what this all means for the upcoming session. The first step post-election is selecting the new leadership for all four caucuses. Uh, Senate Republicans met last week and elected their new leadership team. The two new members of their team are Senator Mary Felskowski, who's now the Senate president. She replaced Chris Kapenga. She uh, made it known she was going to publicly challenge Senator Kapenga, and he decided not to seek reelection to the post, realizing that she had the votes, but definitely more of a teammate of Leader LeMahieu than Chris Kapenga was. So there'll be a lot more continuity of leadership between those two in the direction of the caucus. That being said, with very narrow majority in that caucus, they're going to have to do a lot of outreach and keep people like Chris Kapenga, who, when you've got only two votes, or you really only have one vote to spare, you have to kind of keep everybody in line if you're going to move things on party line votes. The other new member of the leadership team is the majority caucus vice chair, Rachel Cabral Guevara, and joined the leadership team. The Democrats are going to have their caucus election tomorrow. The same with the Assembly Republicans. Right now, we know there is one vacant leadership position in the Assembly leadership, with John Plummer not seeking reelection, and in the Democrats with Christina Shelton. We know that Nate Gustafson is running for a leadership position on the Assembly Republican side. He's someone that's been a bit critical of the speaker in the past, and we'll see how that plays into Speaker Voss being reelected. That'll be the kind of big intrigue tomorrow. There is a subset of the Assembly Republican caucus, just a small handful, that have not been the biggest fans of their speaker, even though he's been able to guide them through some pretty interesting election cycles. And whether or not Speaker Voss has got the 50 votes to get him to return as speaker. I think with that election victory, he should be able to get it with the 54 seats. But that'll be a big news story tomorrow if that does not happen. On the Democratic side, do not expect any major changes to their leadership team. This was the team that was tapped right before the election cycle. So the biggest committee of note where changes will be happening is the Joint Finance Committee. And there are a lot of vacancies now on the Republican side of that committee. Senator Joan Ballweg lost her reelection, so her seat will be up on that committee. Senator Dewey Strobel lost his election, so his seat will be open on that committee. And Mary Felskowski is now the Senate president, and in that leadership role, traditionally you don't serve on the Finance Committee as well. So, 3 new members of that committee. Again, a decision that'll be made by Majority Leader LeMahieu in the near term. I think it's safe to assume that there will at least be one senator from northern Wisconsin chosen. Likely Romaine Quinn would be there to offset Mary Felskowski, and then probably an urban and maybe another rural senator to offset the urban and rural lawmakers that are leaving the committee. But on the Assembly side, right now there's just one opening with Representative Terry Katzman not seeking reelection, so that there's a vacancy there. So coming out of the election cycle, we were interested to hear what the first reactions were from the leaders on how they were going to position the election and how that would impact the upcoming legislative session. I think there is a little fatigue from the election and some of the commercials that were run. Speaker Voss, was not excited about the ads that were run against some of his members by the Democrats. So is not quite there on the olive branch there yet. Feels that they came back with a strong majority, that they're going to be driving the agenda in the legislature and putting things on the governor's desk, and then sounding some warnings on the budget already, saying if we do not use the budget surplus for a tax cut, meaningful tax cut, that money's just going to stay in the surplus fund. That was echoed by Senator Devin Lemonhew in his first post-election press conference. Uh, Greta Neubauer and Minority Leader Hesselbein both, recognized the new numbers, recognized some of the dissension in the Republican caucuses, that getting majority votes with tight majorities is going to be difficult for them on some of the votes, and that they're going to need Democratic votes to get some initiatives. And putting that out there, that they're willing to work to help advance things that are going to be tough to get across the finish line. So it remains to be seen, but right now, all sides are kind of establishing their early positions on working together and what some of their priorities are. The governor does have a significant role in setting the agenda, and that's the state budget process, which is, the first major action that takes place after inauguration. We'll be getting the first update on that here shortly on November 20th, when DOA submits its forecast and summary of all the agency budget requests. And then, as we and other groups start to meet with the governor's office and help them finalize their budget that they introduce in February, that'll be the first major initiative to kick off the legislative session. The one interesting fact on the governor's budget cycle, or this session, and how that plays into the posturing by the legislature, is whether or not Governor Evers is going to run for reelection. There was a lot of thought that if Vice President Harris won reelection, there was going to be a lot of pressure on Governor Evers to run for reelection, because the midterm election of the incumbent party is not very politically easy usually, and having Governor Evers as a steady hand running for reelection would be advantageous for Democrats if Vice President Harris was in her first midterm election cycle. Now that President Trump won, there's another school of thought of whether or not, because traditionally that midterm would be rough for Republicans. Is it an opportunity to have a new face run in this cycle? Remains to be seen, but some of the conversation out there. But depending on if the governor runs for reelection, the budget is a very important document for him to run for reelection on, and what's included in that and how that process goes. So with that, Richelle,
Thank
into
you,
what I've prepared.
Tony. Okay, I really appreciate that overview with information. So, Tony, could you help us just takeaways on some of the key items? How different are the dynamics going into the next legislative session relative to kind of what we've been operating in?
So, I think the biggest thing is the margin of error. So when you have 64 Republicans in the state assembly, and you need to get a bill passed and you only need 50 votes, you can have 12 Republicans say, I'm voting no, or going to pass on voting on that. And there can be a wide disagreement on a policy initiative, but when you have 54, losing 4 votes and getting it down to just having the bare minimum of 50 votes to get something over the finish line, that's tough. Same for the Senate, which had a supermajority at 22-11, now at 18-15. 2 of the incumbent Republicans, Senator Steve Noss and Rob Hutton, didn't vote for the budget last time. So if they don't vote for the budget this time, that gets Republicans down to 16 votes. Not enough to pass it without Democratic votes. So the numbers, definitely change things. They change, the type of policies and, the work of organizations like ours too, because, it's going to take a lot more effort to make sure everybody's educated, because there aren't a lot of throwaway votes to get things done, on things that are, hopefully everything passes 80-19 or, 90-9, but, where things are going to be tough to get across, and there's dissension.
Thank you. I have plenty of questions for you, Tony, but I do want to open it up to the room. So if you have a question or a comment or just a musing, please do feel free to drop that into the chat. Otherwise, you should have control over your own mute, unmute button. You're welcome to use that or raise your hand and I will call on you and we'll make sure to get you into the conversation. Don't be shy. It's a brave space to muse. Okay, let's go to Olivia first. Thank you, Olivia.
Hi guys, and yes, thank you so much. Thanks, Richelle, again for organizing. I was curious, speaking as a FQHC under the lookalike designation, we obviously have some concerns about the 2025 budget and whether or not the new access point will still be a viable means of grant funding for us to retain. And I wonder if you have any insight on that or how the election will shake up the approval of the 2025 budget.
I can take that real quick first, Olivia, and then turn over to Tony to see if you've got any additional insights. But Olivia, as you're noting, this is mostly a federal issue, and then we've got a state topic too, relative to our state grant funding. But all of the health center funding expires in December of this year at the federal government. So Congress is going to need to enact an extension or get some budget bills passed. And we know that HRSA was counting on an increase in health center funding in order to fully fund the NAP grants they had intended to pay to distribute next year. So looking at what the makeup of Congress is moving forward, if Congress punts the federal funding until January, that is going to be a very tough environment for health center funding. Our best hope for health center funding in particular is that the current Congress, who's, in place until the end of the year, would get something done relative to budget bills. But if they don't do an increase, those NAP grants are going to be limited. Tony, anything else on kind of federal funding that's on your mind? Federal government action? I know it's not quite your home base.
Yeah, not my sweet spot. So nothing to add on land.
Olivia, did that at least partially answer your question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Richelle. I appreciate it.
Of course. What other questions or comments do folks have? Oh, Tony, and while folks are thinking, I know there's a few people who were gone from the legislature who are now back by popular demand. Who are those names, just so that advocates on the call can be familiar with them?
Sir, Representative-elect Rob Krybeck, who's from the Eau Claire area. He served in the early 2000s till about 2012, was on was an anchor in an Eau Claire TV network prior to being elected to the legislature. I think worked at Marshfield Clinic for a little bit and did some other community development chamber work in the Eau Claire area. And Representative Dean Coffert from the Neenah Menasha area. He was the finance committee chair in the early 2000s, runs a restaurant and bar in Appleton. He's been out for probably about the same amount of time, about a decade, about 15 years.
Thank you. I just want folks in kind of the Neenah area and Eau Claire to just be aware that you've got folks who are not brand new to the structure. A lot of things are different than last time these lawmakers were in the legislature, but at least to know they are kind of returning faces, people to reacquaint with. I think that's good to know. Tony, you talked a little bit about those changes in leadership, as well as the finance committee. For folks that are a little less engaged in this work day to day, what are the authorities of those leadership members relative to how decisions are made in the Capitol? Why does all of that stuff, really matter?
Yeah. So from the caucus leadership perspective, the speaker in the assembly the minority leader in the assembly, the majority leader in the Senate, and the minority leader in the Senate are really the team captains for their caucuses. So for the Assembly Republicans and Assembly Democrats and Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats. So they set forth kind of the agenda for their caucus, and help get everybody rowing in the same direction. And then they're also the lead negotiators with the governor and their counterparts across the aisle. For the budget appointments, for the Joint Finance Committee appointments, the 16 members of that committee are the ones that take the governor's bill after it's introduced and are the first ones to start parsing it into pieces and advancing proposals that the governor proposed, modifying proposals, or eliminating and replacing them with other proposals. So those 16 lawmakers have a huge say in the budget process, more than any of their colleagues. Obviously, they're taking advice and consent from others, but they're the ones voting on it. It is in both houses a supermajority to the majority party on those committees. So 8 assembly members, 8 Senate members, 6 of the majority party, 2 of the minority parties. So there's 12 Republicans given the current makeup of the legislature and 4 Democrats on that committee. So to modify the governor's budget proposal, you need 9 votes. So you need a majority of that committee to modify it. So if there's split legislative control, then it's really interesting because then Republicans have 8 votes, Democrats have 8 votes, and that gives the governor more authority, or his proposal more opportunity to get through the process because neither side has enough votes to push it out. So.
But just to be clear, that won't be the case for this legislature. The Republicans will have a supermajority on the Joint Finance Committee. So kind of the basic components are the same relative to what we've been working under for that committee, right?
Yeah, I don't imagine. So the governor's had 3 budgets that he's introduced and have gone through the process. This will be his 4th. And because the Republicans control both houses, I imagine they'll, adopt the same procedure where the governor will introduce the budget and they will immediately vote to return it to a base budget and then work to rebuild the budget in the finance committee process.
And the reason I'm asking Tony a lot about this is because we will look for an increase to the Community Health Center state grant next year, and all roads to that funding lead through the finance committee one way or another. So we need to be able to navigate that system. There are a few excellent questions in the chat. So let's start with Dakota's. Dakota's wondering, were there any themes in campaign messages across both the state assembly and the Senate races that departed from the federal narratives that we should keep an eye on in our messaging in the new year? So were you seeing a lot of alignment with the federal kind of issues and messaging, or much departure from that, Tony?
As it related to things that legislators had control over, it did kind of align with the federal conversations. So every Friday we host a candidate for office for a conversation that we invite clients to, and to a person each time we'd ask them, what are you hearing on the doors as you're going out meeting voters and talking to them about why they should elect you. And every time it mimicked that conversation, mimicked what you're hearing in the TV commercials on the federal races. So you had Wisconsin lawmakers being talked about immigration, about reproductive rights, about, so it was very, very much in line with what was being promoted on TV, and kind of expect that if it's promoted so much on TV and person has an opportunity to talk to a lawmaker, it's kind of regurgitated back to them.
Thank you. Do you think that those folks were up for re-election in 2026 in competitive districts? And again, that's the other half of the Senate and then all of the assembly seats again. Will they be more incentivized to work on bipartisan issues? And especially, you noted Senators Hutton, Markline, and Vanguard. Do we think we could see some different engagement from any of them this in the next 2 years leading up to that period.
Yes, absolutely. And that's something that may not be they might not get right out of the chute, but that's something when you have tighter majorities, those lawmakers on the fringe are the sway votes on issues, and they can either help something get over the top or be the ones that stop something from moving forward. So they'll be very I don't think I was going to say susceptible, and that's not the right word, but receptive to constituent communications regarding issues before them, um, because it will have an impact on their reelection. So having more of those 12 members of the legislature that are in the competitive seats that just got through this cycle, and we did see a couple tighter races outside those 12 that will probably now be grouped into that competitive clump. And then the four Senate races that are up next cycle, those lawmakers will definitely be a little more in tune to differences in their districts, and will probably make sure that they're checking in with their constituents before taking votes, especially on high profile issues, and making sure that their communities are coming along with them and they're promoting what they're really interested in.
Thank you, Tony. I want to make sure I'm opening up the floor for questions and comments. Otherwise, I'll just send over a few more to Tony. But again, feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or put a question in the chat. I think just relative to bipartisanship overall, I sometimes I fall into the thinking that, oh gosh, the legislature can't ever find anything to agree on. But then I'm reminded that the governor did sign, more than 100 bills last legislative session. So they can figure some things out, but it doesn't always feel like it's the big, impactful stuff. It's sort of nibbling around the edges. I mean, there was a big compromise developed related to shared revenue and funding for Milwaukee last year. I think that was a big one, an example of bringing parties together that otherwise don't always play nicely in the sandbox. I know, Tony, you can't prognosticate or, guess for next year, but what are the factors that might play in to having a more kind of successful, working relationship? What about how the governor's office engages or how any of that leadership works together? What would be those factors that would lead to more bipartisanship, perhaps?
Um, I mean, I think definitely. I mean, if folks chose to have more meetings and you know go that direction, I think what's going to drive it are events in need. If there is a need to address an issue, I think the legislature and the governor have shown that they know when to put partisan differences aside to address things like shared revenue and the cliff that was hanging there, and especially in the pension funds. Um, but I think it'll take some incentivizing for folks to get a little to the middle. And I think it'll probably take events or some sort of other incentive for them to take on some of the larger issues. I think like Medicaid expansion. Is there a way to incentivize the tax cut that the Republicans want with the Medicaid expansion the governor wants? I mean, there's a path there if folks are willing. Um, but I think it's also what the incentive is to get there.
Yeah, I think there's a few pretty big things, Medicaid expansion, the tax cut issue, that have just been sort of circulating for a few sessions now, that unless lawmakers really want to basically strike a deal on some of those big trade-offs for each other, they really don't feel realistically in the wheelhouse unless there's some sort of bargain made about them. Which, does that feel true to you, Tony?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I know it's a tough position for health centers to be thinking about the strategy and the politics behind all these things when you just see patients that have needs every single day. But it's also part of the world that we operate in. So want to be realistic about those issues. And I think unfortunately, we've been working on this postpartum bill for a few years now, which would provide a full year of Medicaid coverage. But as you included in the slide, Tony, Speaker Voss has really put his foot down on that issue and sees it as a welfare expansion. And even with basically a near majority support of Republicans last session, it didn't get over the finish line. Do you think there's anything that would dislodge that one?
I too early to tell, I guess.
But maybe something, to find compromise on relative to
Yep,
bigger conversations. Okay.
absolutely.
Um,
But like you
yeah,
said,
go
I
ahead.
think, I mean, a lot is going to still get done. It, may not be some high profile issues, but still, probably 500-600 bills are going to get through the process. Um,
Thanks for
and,
bringing me out of the doom and gloom, Tony. And, I'm reminded too, I think it's a really important message for advocates. There are windows of opportunity, and it's often hard to expect when they will come up. But that happened with dental therapy last year or earlier this year. It's still 2024, January. We worked on that bill for more than 7 years, and it came together at a time that I didn't really expect. But that bill was enacted, and there was a lot of vehement opposition to it. A different type of opposition, less political and more industry. But things do happen, and we need to be ready with those relationships and ready with the expertise when they do come up, when the window opens. Tony, any last words for our group before I provide a few last resources and folks sign off for the day? Any takeaways? How should we be moving into the next year?
I mean, there's a lot of lawmakers there's a significant amount of turnover from this last election. There's still a significant amount of turnover from the previous election. So a lot of new faces that are still, even as, sophomore lawmakers coming back after their first term, there's still a lot of opportunity to get to know folks and be a resource. So, the opportunities to reach out to lawmakers, please take advantage of those, and the invites to do visits and communicate are not wasted and are at a premium right now as they're learning to get to know people, and especially people that can be resources for them on complex issues like the ones that impact health centers.
Thank you, Tony. Then just a few last items here. I'm going to drop a link into the chat. We do have a monthly policy and advocacy newsletter for folks who are on the call here today. And if you want to get more information like this, but in an email right to your inbox, please go ahead and sign up for that. I usually provide links to webinars, interesting articles, resources, updates on all health center funding. And again, that is sent out monthly. You can sign up for it at the link I just dropped in the chat, and it is item number 5 there in the purple box if you scroll down. I will also send out, Tony and his team have bios for all the legislators, new and returning. So I have that wonderful resource for all of you. So I'll share that in our follow-up materials here today. This is our last lunchtime policy call of the year since we're kind of heading into the holiday season, but we'll restart these again in January. Otherwise, the big role for health centers is to be building up those relationships. And even with folks who aren't really sworn in until January of next year, if you have a relationship with someone, or if you want to start that now, you can go ahead and do that outreach, invite them to your clinic, have a walkthrough, set up a cup of coffee for a discussion, and let them know about the work of your health center. We do have a lot of materials getting ready for the next legislative session. Those will all be widely distributed and hopefully helpful tools for you. The final ask, since we're thinking about next year already, is mark your calendars. April 2nd in Madison is going to be our State Lobbying Day, also known as State Policy and Issues Forum. That's a really exciting opportunity to come down to Madison, visit legislator offices, and make our priorities known for the next legislative session. So again, that was Wednesday, April 2nd. And you'll see an email from me with the slides and a recording from today, hopefully by the end of the day. And again, I really want to thank Tony Langenohl from Michael Best Strategies, who does phenomenal work for us in the Capitol. I look forward to seeing all of you in the weeks and months to come, engaging on policy issues. And thank you in advance for all of the advocacy that health centers have already done this year. I know there have been some really wonderful lawmaker visits, very impactful conversations, and a lot of follow-ups, and for all the work you'll be doing moving forward. I'll stay on the call for a few more minutes in case anyone has questions, but thank you so much for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon or Monday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all.